imagine yourself as a developer coming in, wanting to build a certain project. What do they need to do to get that to completion? And ask yourself, as a town, as a city, what is necessary here? What are the benefits and costs of this particular regulation that we have on the books, or this step that's involved? The minimum lot size restriction at the state level, I think, is 20,000 square feet.
Yeah.
So if you have something more than that, ask yourself why. That, our study shows, is an important lever that you have as a locality to potentially reduce housing prices. Can you bring that down 10,000, 20,000 feet or square feet? So I would say taking inventory is a good first step. If I could wave a magic wand, that's a difficult question to answer, because there's so many layers to it. But I would love to see towns take this seriously, to take inventory of what their processes look like, and to actually study it and imagine themselves being a developer who wants to build there. What kind of town do you want to be? Do you want to be a town that gates people out, or do you want to be a town that that helps others, welcomes others?
Welcome to Housing Matters, the podcast that covers everything real estate, from buying your first home to building your investment portfolio. Hosted by me, Matt Pouliot, Pouliot Real Estate. Each episode brings expert insights, smart strategies, and real talk on housing and affordability. If it's about real estate, it matters here. I'm thrilled to have joining us today Jim Siodla, who is the Associate Professor of Economics at Colby College. James received his PhD in economics from the University of California, Irvine in 2013. His areas of research include urban economics and U.S. economic history, with a focus on redevelopment following large urban disasters and municipal budgets during the Roaring '20s and the Great Depression. He has published papers in a variety of academic journals. Jim, thank you for being here today.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I want to start really right off, Jim, with the fact that you've studied everything from post-fire city rebuilding to local budgets during the Great Depression. And how did your path lead to zoning, housing, and the modern challenges that are being faced here in Maine and even more broadly in the U.S.?
I would say my journey into housing issues started before I went to graduate school. I was a real estate appraiser coming out of my undergrad and did that for 3.5 years on the tax assessor side. So this was for a county in California. And at that point, I was becoming more interested in sort of the spatial issues and different spatial dynamics that take place in cities. And being a real estate appraiser helped me understand how neighborhoods impact housing values, how different amenities impact housing values. And I became very interested in housing at that point. When I went to graduate school, I went to a place that had a really strong emphasis in urban economics, economic history as well. I went there having a sense that I'd like to try those things, to do those things and focus on those things in my research. And I did. I was able to do some work on the 1906 San Francisco fire, which you mentioned, and urban redevelopment following that fire. And housing was a small part of that. So I was looking at land use changes in the city as a result of the fire, and particular how housing changed, how the housing stock changed as a result of that. And I've always had that interest in housing since, I'd say, it's been about 20 years now since I was a real estate appraiser. But that has always been a part of sort of my interest. It's come from that time period. And the focus on Maine has been interesting just in the last few years with the rise in housing prices we've seen here. When we first came here in 2013, my wife and I were pretty happy to just get a house, and we didn't expect appreciation like we've seen over the last few years. It was actually, the rental market was very dire. We didn't find anything that was something we wanted to rent, and so we focused on buying when we first got here, and we bought a house in 2013. But Maine has seen, as you know, a large increase in housing prices over the last few years, and housing affordability has been...
Yeah, for those listening and maybe not familiar, Maine saw what I have found for data, the highest per capita increase in home prices since 2019, 74% in the U.S. And I don't know, I haven't really spent a ton of time vetting that out, but it does feel that Maine has seen among the largest increase in home prices nationally.
Yeah, I was just seeing I saw a graph yesterday, I believe, showing where in the country we're seeing more of these kinds of price appreciation. Maine was definitely one of those states in New England where we see a large amount of price appreciation. Some southern states are starting to see some stabilization in housing prices, even some declines, but Maine hasn't seen that yet. So there's definitely a question of why, right? And I think for me, trying to understand what's driving those housing prices, why is it outpacing income growth, wage growth? That's really kind of the key thing we want to understand is why is it that housing prices continually outpace any sort of income growth we see in the economy? And that's where it becomes a problem.
Yeah, and I think staying on this discussion of your background and what it was that you were studying, in post-fire city rebuilding, I think about the modern events going on right now with the wildfires in California, right? And the areas that are being hit largely seem to be, as best I can tell, larger plots of land, home for, in California's sake, bigger homes like that are not necessarily entry-level homes for people. And then does California rebuild based on its existing zoning or say, hey, look, we're going to change something, and can they? Because you've got people that are legacy locked into their half-acre plot, that is zoned a certain way, and the place burns down, the insurance company is only going to give you money to rebuild what was there, not a 4-unit or something, which may be better suited. I'm curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, and I think, it's a good point that this is an opportunity for LA to think about what they could do differently on the zoning side when you have something of a clean slate to work from. There are barriers still, and this is where my research comes in on San Francisco. This was pre-zoning, pre-land use regulations. You had some building and fire regulations, but they're relatively minor compared to what we see today in 1906. So the city is rebuilding in an almost free market sort of setting, right? But there are still barriers to building denser units. The city was growing and thriving, and suddenly it was offered this sort of, clean slate. Now it was massively destructive, but at the same time, there's this new opportunity to make changes. The city ends up redeveloping much more densely in burned areas relative to unburned areas. They're building apartment complexes, they're building denser forms of housing because the city needed it and population was growing. And so the idea is, why did that happen after the fire? Why did it take a fire to do that? And the fire essentially ends up being something that sort of clears away some of the barriers that are normally there in development. Normally, you have to find the right landowner to want to build these kinds of places. You've got to sell these properties. You've got to assemble lots potentially to make bigger parcels so that you can build these bigger buildings. And those are the kinds of things that are less costly in the wake of a fire potentially because you don't have a structure there that sort of impedes the negotiation process, for instance. LA has an opportunity to do that. They would have to make some zoning changes. They are operating in an institutional setting that's much different from San Francisco's was in 1906. But you bring up the point that zoning is an important piece of that puzzle. They would have to upzone, right? A lot of these areas to make that happen. And I don't know, I would say there's demand for it. I mean, the values of land in that area are really, really high. Normally that's a signal to developers to build more densely, right? Let's economize on land and build more, taller buildings.
Yeah. Do you see these people that were living in like $1.5 million single family ranch in LA, like just saying, I'm out, I'm going to take my insurance proceeds and just offer the land for sale? I haven't been really following that at all.
Yeah, I haven't either, to be honest. And it's been only, 7, 8, 9 months. So I'm not sure what's happening on the ground. I think that's another concern we have with today's world versus 1906. I mean, the city of San Francisco rebuilt rather quickly. So who knows how long this will take for LA. But you have, this speaks to the point of regulations that kind of become barriers and are not necessarily conducive to quick reconstruction.
Yeah, I can't really think of a better example than a real life one that demonstrates about let's call it 120 years removed from, we've done a lot in this country over that period of time to build up zoning and regulations, mostly in the name of safety, but really under the guise of, I just want to kind of protect my own thing. And I already have this, so don't take it away from me.
Right.
Which seems to be more prevalent. And I'm curious your thoughts on this, just as, an idea that I have of being like post World War II, baby boomers have a lot of these newly created entitlement programs, and then these continue to grow, and they build their life around things like, getting Social Security in my equity in my home as my nest egg, like that kind of was put on a mortgage, and I'm going to pay that off, and that's the thing that I have to like maintain my security in retirement, from a financial perspective. And then the person wants to come in next door that has none of that going on and just tear down this old house and put a 3-unit building in there, which is great for urban infill probably, but leaves the person like, oh my God, what's this going to do to the value of my single family home?
Yeah, that is certainly something that economists and urban economists in particular have focused on, is the idea of how the value of your home, there's an incentive to protect that and to try and increase the value of it. And so that's where I think a lot of the motivation for so-called NIMBYism, or not in my backyard movements, is changing the character of a neighborhood tends to increase density, bring in uses that potentially people don't want to see, and that could lead, their argument is that it could lead to a decrease in housing values. The research doesn't seem to bear that out for a lot of reasons, but that is, I think, their big argument. And, we see this happen quite often and quite a lot, is that, I think a lot of cities face that large NIMBY groups, and these groups can potentially stop development. They have tools to do that, right? And it really only takes a relatively small minority of people who are impacted to make a change and to keep development from happening.
I just think it's really interesting, the background that you have, and then now seeing this kind of repeat itself obviously in a different, location, but still within the same state. I would argue a state that has among the highest levels of regulation from government, in a lot of respects, but also seems to be very forward-thinking in terms of housing creation, some of the things that they've done in California. So this is going to be a good litmus test to see, do you guys really believe this or not?
Yeah, I agree. There's a lot of state-level legislation that's really interesting coming out of California, the ADU laws that they're passing, and environmental impact, trying to streamline that process of getting environmental impact reviews done. Those are all good things to kind of get the balls rolling with regard to housing construction. So,
Well, I want to shift a little bit to your role in the under construction report. First, what was under construction report for those who haven't heard of it? And then you were really the brain behind Section 2 of that, the zoning and minimum lot size analysis. Can you walk us through what you found and how you did the work?
Yeah, absolutely. Under Construction is a report done by the Maine Policy Institute focused on trying to understand the relationship between land use regulations and housing supply and housing prices. They approached me last summer with the idea that they'd like to do a study on the state of Maine with regard to the housing market here. And I was interested in it because I've been watching sort of housing affordability become a real problem here. So I said yes, and I did, as you mentioned, a lot of the analysis behind the scenes on the report. And what we're doing in this report is sort of a 10,000-foot level view of housing in the state of Maine. And so we're focused on trying to understand the relationship between land use regulations, i.e., in our case, we're looking at zoned cities versus non-zoned cities. And I'll talk about that maybe in a few minutes. And then also the impact of minimum lot size restrictions on housing prices and housing supply, the supply of new construction in the state. And so, those are two big land use regulations that get a lot of attention in the literature on urban economics. And we wanted to focus on Maine and try and understand whether Maine is seeing what other parts of the country are seeing, what other studies have shown to be the case nationally. What does it look like in Maine? Do these land use regulations really do they significantly increase housing prices here? Do they restrict housing supply? Our results broadly suggest yes, and that Maine is no exception to what's being experienced across the country. And so I can speak to any of those sorts of analyses that we did in the paper. But.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think I like to try to keep things real life on this show as well, and I do some development work. And recently, there's a small town, close proximity to us, next town over, Chelsea, which had a requirement that you have a 2-acre minimum lot size with 200 feet of frontage. And recently, just in June, the town ratified a change to minimum lot size within the town for residential to reduce to 60,000 square feet. So like just over 1.4 acres from 2, and down from 200 feet of road frontage to 100, which to me, the lot size is a big deal, but road frontage requirements can eat up a huge amount of cost.
Yeah.
And so I was then able to, with this new change, create the first subdivision under that change. In fact, that we had met at the planning board and it was like, we can't sign off on this until the town actually ratifies the change. They hadn't even codified it yet.
Oh, wow.
So it was all through the lens of like, this is coming. And I knew the risk was if this doesn't get ratified by the town vote, then we'll have to wait, and hopefully in the future it will change, or we have to pivot and have less lots. So now we were then able to create more lots, which allowed us to bring the costs that we had to get down for those lots to net the same amount of money down, right? And so now we're selling lots for, 40 to 50,000 that might have needed to be 60 or 70,000 in order for the economics to work out.
Right.
And I have a hard time articulating this to some people sometimes who live in these towns, like, why is this advantageous? Well, if you're living here, you want to see less lots, less being built, less competition for your home, which hopefully drive the price up, right? That's a short-sighted, not raising all tides raise all boats approach that many take. I mean, I understand where they're coming from. It's out of a place of safety and security, but in the end, they end up shooting themselves in the foot because they're not thinking about the fact that all the costs are going to continue to go up for plowing, sanding, the schools, and everything. And if we don't have some people here that are helping offset that, then my taxes are going to have to go up, or we cut services. Yeah. So to me, this is very profound in Maine, and I'm curious your thoughts on it, where we have a situation where a lot of people, not too different nationally, but even maybe more pronounced here because we have an older population, that I think really does mean well. They just don't understand that. They're not thinking about the economics of it. Like, hey, Augusta's been the same population since 1970s, but it hasn't been the same budget since the 1970s. So who do you think's paying for that?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Those costs are going up. Yeah. I think that's right, and I think it's important to think about the long term, think about your children, your grandchildren, and what they're having to face. I think most of us, this goes to why I think this is a bipartisan issue. I think most of us would hope that our kids and our grandkids can do better than we did, right? And it's starting to look like that's less a possibility, right, in recent years. But yeah, I think that's right. I think growth begets growth, and growth expands the tax base for a city or a town. That could be a really good thing. You mentioned the minimum lot size restrictions and how that what they were doing there in Chelsea was that you were able to potentially create more density, right? It sounds like you haven't built the buildings or anything, but splitting the lots into smaller chunks is definitely something that contributes to density.
And like one thing that we're doing there is using, like when I created the subdivision, I didn't put any restrictions about using manufactured homes. And there's many of them around in close proximity to this. It's not like we're sticking in a new product. And so realistically, if all things go well, by like February of 26, all of those lots will have a home on them, which with the average rate of building in Maine per builder being like 1.5 homes a year, if we were to traditionally stick built on site and have a very similar product in terms of like how the user interfaces with it living in their home, it would take, probably a couple years if I was just like to hire a builder and say, build out some spec homes in here,
Yeah.
But instead, I'm selling the lots to companies that are dealers for manufactured homes so that they can, say we have a piece of land for you to put this house that you want to buy if you're generally agnostic on exactly where you are, but you want to be in a certain distance to whatever the labor market is, then we have this option for you. And a lot of people are choosing that because it's the path of least resistance. Like, that's my payment. That's where I'm going to be. Okay, I like that area. Great. I'm good to go. And what we see a lot is, the minimum lot sizes don't make the economics work out. And your report really found, I think, that by the minimum lot size of 10,000 square feet boosts an average home price by about 4%, which translates to around $16,000 for the typical Maine home priced at $400,000. Why do they matter so much, and what are really driving those price increases?
Yeah, great question. Basic economics, kind of think about things on the demand side and the supply side here. So one argument could be people demand bigger lots, and that's what they want, right? So maybe it's all driven by the demand side. But what we find, and we control for a lot of those demand factors as much as we can, but we find that it's really a supply restriction issue. So when you restrict supply, you drive up the price of anything, right? And if we're restricting the housing supply, we're driving up the price of housing. Now, why do minimum lot size restrictions tend to do that, tend to increase housing prices and restrict supply? It has to do with sort of what a minimum lot size restriction does is mandates, right, that someone consume a certain amount of land when, in fact, they may not want that much, right? There are plenty of, people who might prefer to consume less land. So that's driving up the housing price. You're having to pay for that land in some fashion. But it's also restricting the supply of housing. So it sounds like with Chelsea, the ability to subdivide into more lots, you're providing more housing stock in a way that serves to stabilize housing prices. So when we increase the supply of anything, that tends to reduce those costs, or those prices, I should say. And so in this case, minimum lot size restrictions, when we relax those, when we bring them down a bit, what we're doing is allowing more lots to be built upon, and that's going to be something that increases density, increases the housing stock, the supply of the housing stock, and thereby stabilizes prices, potentially even decreasing prices.
Yeah, it's interesting. And your research shows that towns that have zoning have on average about a 7% higher home prices than similar unzoned towns. Why is that, and what's the mechanism? Is zoning really always the villain, or is it something else?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and this is something I think our study just touches on, scratches the surface. I personally would like to do more digging into that. But the mechanism could very well be, the research shows that zoning does, in general, nationally, that zoning does tend to increase housing prices. What zoning does is it implements this so-called regulatory tax, which we, in urban economics, think of as the difference between a price a house sells for and the cost of building it, absent any government barriers. So the cost of building it includes labor, materials, land, and some reasonable developer profit and some other things in there as well. That gap between the housing price and what it costs to build it, even with some of the, the profit margin that a developer receives, is substantial in a lot of places in the country. In San Francisco, New York City, you're seeing housing prices that are double construction costs and, of building a house. And so that's an incredible gap. It can't be explained away simply by the things that zoning does that are good, like potentially reducing traffic in certain areas, reducing noise pollution, separating land uses. Those are things that zoning does that can be useful. But the gap that often arises between price and construction costs can't be explained away simply by those factors. There's a lot left over that's explained by supply restrictions and zoning density restrictions and minimum lot size restrictions and so on. So what we're finding is research that's consistent with that idea that there's a regulatory tax being imposed on new housing through zoning.
Like a real life example that comes to mind when you're talking about this is my perception that America has largely built out its built environment around the automobile. And, obviously, like, for instance, Augusta, really Maine in general, just has terrible public transportation options. And a lot of people live further away from these urban centers where services are. And now we've become a service economy, really, in Maine, where the majority of our GDP, and I could be wrong about this, but is coming from service-related jobs, whether in the healthcare or tourism or retail or whatever,
Yeah.
And so you don't have, you don't have these big job centers, if you will, that were like centered around the mills and like everybody worked at the mill or supported something at the mill. Now the mill is like a computer.
Yeah.
And so now it's like, how do we get and encourage people to come closer to where they could use public transportation so that we don't need to like have every lot has 4 parking spaces on it, which is a zoning thing that really does drive up cost. Like we're looking at doing, a client I work with, a 300+ unit apartment complex in downtown Lewiston next to a 590 space parking garage. And it's like all the parking that you would ever need is there. But that had to be massaged big time because the zoning said it had to be on site, not like next door.
Right.
And they got through that with the town because the overarching, 10,000 or 30,000 foot level, whatever you want to call it, is we need more housing. So how are we going to work with you on this?
Right.
But I think that has only been the narrative kind of in the last like 5 years. Before it was like, here's the bar. If you can jump over it, great. We'll talk to you, as opposed to like, maybe we should modify where the bar is from the zoning part.
Absolutely. I think there's incredible margins for improvement that cities can take on this and towns on the zoning requirements and the different bundles of different regulations that exist in zoning. It's incredibly complex. I know Portland's been trying to simplify the code a little bit and do some changing in certain areas. Those are I think good things to do. Minimum lot size restrictions, parking requirements, those are important. I think important margins is where changes can be made. I think too, to your point, we devote an awful lot of space to the car. You can easily kind of look around any city or town and say, where do we put our value? We put our value on mobility and being able to drive from one place to the next. We got a lot of space available for every car that people own. They take up a lot of space, and public transit options would be wonderful. Those are incredibly expensive, as you know, and difficult. But I think developers probably know best about how much parking to include in a particular location. And if we let them compete on that level, the right amount of parking should surface, right? We should see that if the market's working well. Developers are going to internalize that. They're going to build the correct amount of parking, at least what they foresee being needed for a particular restaurant or whatever it is that they're building that they're renting out, whatever it is. But that's what I would see as a potential policy margin that could be influenced.
But it seems to me you have this confluence of events occurring in real time in our life where we're seeing another kind of evolution of mass adoption of technology, kind of, this AI coming into play and whatnot. And then you have zoning that's this really like arcane, just black and white, super difficult to like change quickly thing, at odds with the fact that like now Tesla's launching cars that are self-driving, and okay, maybe we don't have the economics to support a robust build out of an entire bus system or a train transit or whatever, but the economics make sense for Tesla to start sending some self-driving cars here. I'm just using that as an example.
Yeah.
And now we have at our fingertips something that didn't even exist 10 years ago, let alone probably 30 years ago when the actual zoning was put in place in that municipality. And someone comes forward from a performance zoning standard saying, hey, this will work, and I'm betting on the fact that 10% of my tenants are going to use a Tesla self-driving car. They're not, and the person sitting there on the planning board's like, that's never going to happen.
Yeah.
And they don't believe it. And so they're like, deny because you didn't have the spots. It's like,
yeah.
Why don't you just, I'm the one willing to risk all the capital here and everything. I just need permission to do it.
Yep.
And it's at odds with the technology revolution that didn't even exist in 1906 when San Francisco burned down.
Right. You're absolutely right that these are old, arcane documents and codes, right? Zoning came into being in 1910s, 1920s. It really grew quite a lot. A lot of today's codes can be kind of compared to the older codes, and you really don't see a huge change. Some more complexity, for sure. When codes were first introduced, it was about separating land uses, some density restrictions, and so on, but that was really as far as it went. But now you've got a whole layer of regulations that have been added over the years. So zoning certainly calcifies, I think, a city when, you have new technologies that allow a city to adapt and change, but the code that oversees where economic activity can take place is old and outdated. So this is important, I think, for cities to constantly review, take into account what's happening on the ground level, and potentially make changes that can be useful and helpful for.
I'm curious your thoughts on something, and we didn't put this in the notes, so feel free to decline. But there's an effort here nationally going on about the zoning atlas. This idea that we would have one kind of document where, at a glance, you could see how different parcels were zoned and then what's allowed in them. Are you familiar with this at all?
I might be. This sounds semi-familiar.
And Maine, it's kind of like a nonprofit effort that's going on, and Maine is standing up a group right now to look at this. New Hampshire has their zoning atlas done.
Okay.
So that you can log in and just see, all right, at a glance, what's allowed, as opposed to, all right, I want to buy 123 Banana Street. Now I got to go to the table of contents within the land use regulations within the website for the city of Augusta, let's say.
Right.
And look up to see what's allowed there. And then, I got to go to another page to see how many units per, lot size. You get the point. It's the world that you live in.
Right.
And so at a glance would be able to say basically yes, a 4-unit can go there without going through that whole exercise.
Right. I think that's useful. I am familiar with this project, and it's great to hear that there's a group in Maine kind of building this up. I think that's helpful. We have a lot more information at our fingertips these days, ways to make these codes more readable. And I think it also allows for a certain level of competition. Now, if people can compare and contrast, right, that competitive nature can come out. Some cities and towns may respond to that and streamline certain processes. And this is where I think at the local level, a lot could be done,
Because we really don't have a free market for housing creation, if we're being honest with ourselves.
Yeah.
We have this whole level of regulation that is very, to say it again, esoteric to most citizens, not because they're ignorant, but just never really been exposed to
interface with it. Engage with it.
And then when they do, it's usually in the realm of not in my backyard, not instead of getting involved in the comp plan creation for the community and talking about what's our vision and what do we want to see.
Yeah.
I mean, Augusta, just as an example, and I'm sure it's not too different from many former, mill towns across the country, particularly in New England, has really decided to be more bullish about housing, but more so than just saying we're bullish around housing, really having, sending city manager and city planners to development conferences and really trying to get the word out that just please trust us if you bring your project here. And that's a hard part to overcome, particularly in Maine. We're so small that people have these stigmas of towns. We could say Lewiston, and certain people are like, whoa, the dirty Lou. Well, the economics are still that they need 1,400 units in the next 4 years. Who's going to do it? Somebody needs to do it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think part of that is overcoming the stigmas that people have about certain communities to recognize, well, they still need housing and the economics will still work. If you can deliver at the price that the area median income can pay, which is a whole other, we could spend a whole episode on that.
Right. Yeah, I think it's, providing more certainty for developers, taking some of that uncertainty out of the equation, I think could be really helpful and useful and go a long way. When you're talking about delays and you're talking about developments that you build and you spend all this time kind of planning and then it hits a roadblock somewhere along the line, that's something that dissuades developers from taking on new projects. That all leads to restrictions on housing in the end, elevates housing prices and inflates them. So I think anything you can do to create some certainty in the process is going to be a helpful thing.
Yeah. You've mentioned that housing should be a bipartisan issue, which I totally agree with. When you present this data to town officials or advocates, what kind of reactions do you get? And are anybody's minds changing?
It's a good question. I haven't done a whole lot of the public-facing stuff with the study. Harris, the co-author at Maine Policy Institute, has done more of that, so he might be a good person to have on as well. But I have had some email exchanges with town leaders in different places in the state that have kind of found the report, looked at it, and wanted to ask some questions. I'm getting a sense that there's more interest in this. I think people are seeing that this is a big issue here, that we're not immune to it in Maine. And if anything, potentially are facing a stiffer challenge here than in other places.
In what way?
Just, Maine is a place where we're seeing some in-migration, right? In other parts of the country, that's not the case. The last few years, we've seen people actually move here, right? And for such a long time.
How do we balance this? Because I got a call from a guy the other day, and I'm not going to share his name, but he was calling about a property. I said, this, because we have a brokerage, this property is no longer available. It's under contract. And he just kind of went off the deep end. He's like, I can't seem to get a leg up against these immigrants that are just coming in here and buying up all the housing. I've been working my whole life, I'm going through it. I'm like, I listened to this and I understand where he's coming from. It's out of a sense of frustration, but I had to stop him and just say, hey, look, with all due respect, you're like a white guy in America, so you're already doing better than like 99% of the world's population right now, who's like struggling to figure out how they're going to eat tomorrow, or they don't even have a roof over their head, So like when you have that kind of a mindset, the victim mindset, I call it, which seems to be really prevalent, particularly among people who bought into this narrative that if I just go work my 40-hour a week job and put into Social Security, then I'm going to be fine. And they're starting to come to the realization that that's not true.
Right.
In the midst of also a whole generation of people that you talked about earlier that really even can't enter the market just because what the wages are paying is not in line with where the prices have gone.
Exactly.
Largely caused by some of this in-migration. And so, like, I'm not saying that was the complete culprit, and maybe I'm totally wrong here, but how do you drive that? Like, the growth is good. We need the net immigration to fill the jobs. Somebody's got to be the CNA at the hospital to take care of you.
Absolutely, yeah.
With the fact that the CNA is not even actually making enough to afford the housing.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think our report speaks to this a bit. I think, the demand side is there. People are coming in, buying houses. Prices are going up. So people see that and they say, well, it has to do with population growth and people coming in, people from outside that are buying up these places. Sure. Yeah. I mean, any place that experiences population growth, if you keep the housing stock the same, it's going to get reflected in those housing prices. One thing we can do, though, is welcome people and say, we want our state to grow and thrive and not die. Right? Maine's awesome. We've loved it here for 12 years, my wife and I and our family. It's a great place to be. So I totally understand the reason people want to move here. So what can we do in response? Well, we can potentially work to increase the housing stock. And I think the barriers have always sort of been there, but Maine's never had to experience the demand side like we have in recent years that kind of reflect and show what those barriers actually do. With a stable population, none of that really plays, right? It doesn't matter so much. But once demand is driven up, and you see housing prices start to climb, that's where developers should come in and say, hey, let's build. Like, the incentive's there. We should be building. And, it's not been, we haven't seen the kind of response we should see when those prices
in a large
go up.
part because we don't have the labor force to build the housing here,
Right.
because of the aging population. And also these regulations that people just hit up against, or they hear these horror stories and they're like, look, I'm running a REIT in Massachusetts. I don't really feel like going up and pursuing a 250-unit apartment complex in, Maine, because it seems like they invest $100,000 or $200,000 in development costs only to get to the planning board and have the whole thing shot down.
Absolutely, that uncertainty again, right? And that's all gonna dissuade people from building. I think the nature of the problem is on the supply side, and you mentioned labor as well being a constraint. There's no doubt about it. I mean, we're finding, of course, in our study that land use regulations play a role, but the construction industry is facing labor shortages and a lack of skilled workers, and there's a lot of bigger picture things happening here. I think, to attribute the rise in housing costs to one factor is perhaps a little bit short-sighted. I mean, there's nuance to this, and I think that's unfortunately, the political climate right now. It's one extreme or the other. But I think a lot of times the nuance.
It's easier to fearmonger and blame a villain when really the problem is us.
Yeah.
Like, we created these rules. And when I say us collectively, I mean the citizens of the state or wherever you are. Like, these are the rules that you created, or were around when they were created. You might not have been actively involved, but they are the rules that we're playing with. So when we have a flood of 300,000 people or 100,000 or whatever it is, we can't just pivot quickly to like creating more stuff because the rules say thou shalt not do that.
Right.
So like either we change the rules or we tell people to stop coming. Now, a lot of people want to do the latter, not the former.
Yeah.
I'm more interested in, and I think you are and others committed to this effort in changing the former. Like, how do we change the rules to deal with it as opposed to just fear-mongering to people saying, don't come here because we don't have room for you. Like, how are we going to make room for you?
Yeah. Yep, absolutely. I'd rather focus on that side of the dimension. That's an innovative, creative, welcoming response that I think would go a long way to making the state of Maine even better.
Yeah, and reducing the average age of our workforce.
Absolutely.
And
that's necessary. And
increasing participation. I mean, Maine has the lowest, I think, unemployment rate in the country, among the lowest, but we're oftentimes not looking at participation, like how many are actually seeking the jobs.
Yeah.
That goes into that equation.
Absolutely.
And our participation rates are much lower, not the bottom by any means, but that to me is another piece of this.
Yep, absolutely. I agree.
So I want to switch to like, what if we get it right? Let's play out, an alternative. If Maine towns started allowing smaller lots by right development, eased permitting, created this utopia, right, of like it's so easy to do smaller stuff, faster, cheaper. Like, how much of a difference can that actually make for first-time buyers or even like retirees that are trying to downsize?
Yeah. I mean, it's a great question, and we economists like to think about counterfactuals a lot. So thinking about what could be, I think, is an important exercise. I would say there's a great example. There was an article in the Wall Street Journal last week about New Rochelle, New York, outside of Manhattan, city of 85,000 people or so, that has actually done a lot at the ground level to respond to the housing shortage there. And what they've done is everything they can to streamline the local planning approval process. They're guaranteeing developers a 90-day approval process completely if they meet certain criteria. I'm interested in that. Let's talk a little bit more about. Like, I wish I knew more. I may not be able to.
It's all right. But so basically, they say to the development community, here's our commitment to you, development world. If you come and say that you'll do business here, we'll guarantee you within 90 days to either have a yes or a no.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's the basic idea. They're again trying to reduce the uncertainty associated with development and give developers a quick yes or no rather than waiting and delaying and potentially putting in all this effort and time for naught. So I think they recognize that that's an issue, that developers are not, they're more encouraged by a quick process, and that helps them in their planning and potentially leads to more housing. So they've basically taken a look at their codes. They've tried to do as much as they can, I think, from my understanding of it, to streamline the process. And what you've seen there is a lot of construction. They've built something like 11,000 multifamily units. A lot of these are in apartments and so on in the last decade and a half.
Yeah.
And rents since 2020 for a lot of places have gone very high, right? They've increased quite a bit. In New Rochelle, they've been pretty stable in the last 3 or 4 years. And so it's economics at work. You're seeing essentially what we would expect, what economic theory predicts would occur, right? You increase the supply, you stabilize the rents. And that's, that's one story of one locality taking it upon themselves to make a change. And it sounds like Chelsea is doing something similar in some ways,
even
right?
Auburn, for instance, had a very forward-thinking mayor for a period of time that was like, hey, why don't we take all the municipal lots, you, Economic Development Department, put together a pro forma and an RFP for what we want on that lot. Let's say that this site we've determined based on our codes, and we're going to do what we want to allow for a 20 unit there. So it's not just here's a municipal parcel, you figure it out. Instead, it's been packaged up to be able to be sold to a development community that needs to make an up or down decision based on the economics. That's the final decision. It's about math.
Yeah.
And a lot of these zoning things turn into a math problem that then someone does the math and they're like, oh, it doesn't add up to something the bank will put money behind or an investor.
Yeah.
So it seems like in New Rochelle or maybe Auburn or in Chelsea, these efforts changing density and so forth, but then going the next level like New Rochelle did or what Auburn did and saying, hey, look, like advertising that, and sharing with the world, like, hey, these are real life opportunities that exist here.
Yep.
And whether it's a quicker permitting commitment to you or we have X number of lots available that can do this, which ones do you want? I mean, the municipalities can almost give them away because they're going to generate tax revenue that they don't currently have.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're packaging a certain sort of bundle of things together, right? And you're giving them more information, which is always helpful in a planning process.
Yeah.
So
it seems like it really can move the needle, but it's a discussion that many people, I think, don't engage in because they're not familiar with it. So they feel like, hey, I don't really have a place to say anything about this, but we all do as community members because we're living in this area.
Yeah.
Like, what do we want it to be?
Yeah.
And I don't think a lot of people think, I have a background in being in the planning board and in politics and stuff. So my worldview is always like, okay, how do we change these rules? And majority of people are just living within what was created. Even developers, a lot of times, will be like, well, it's zoned this way, we can't do it. It's like, well, what about approaching them for a contract zone change? Or,
variance.
well, I don't know if they're going to do it or not. Well, true, I don't know either.
Yeah.
And then it just stops.
It stops. Yeah, exactly. Right. To the extent that we can reduce that, it's not going to impact everybody, right? But you might let in a few more developers in that way and a few more construction projects that might occur that otherwise wouldn't. So I think for people, it's really easy for us to focus on what we see and to not think about what the unseen could be, right? And that's an important thing to keep in mind, is that the world we could be living in, the unseen world, it could be a lot better for everybody, right? And I think that's true for housing as well, that housing affordability could be much more affordable than it is now. And I think...
well, I was on the George Hale Rick Tyler show recently, and they posed a question to the audience because we were talking about like housing creation and different... actually, this project that I'm working on to create a new manufactured housing community, which Augusta hasn't permitted one in over 20 years. So when you go to the planning department, like, hey, what do I need to do this? So they're all like... None of us were here the last time this was done, so we're going to work with you, but we're going to have to figure it out, which in my mind is like, okay, I'm going to pay an engineer to come up with something for you to say, no, not quite.
Yeah.
But I'm willing to go down that road. But we talked a lot about, why do we need to do this in terms of a housing product? Well, because you have a lot of aging population. They don't want stairs and repairs anymore, but they don't also have a viable option of another place to go to. And so what they often want to do is cash out the equity they have in their home, which is a boat anchor for them. They can transfer that to maybe an enterprising individual or family or whatever it is to turn into something else for themselves at maybe a lower cost. And then they take that equity and put it into something that's like brand new and paid for, but is a totally different size, shape, feel from what they were coming from, like an old farmhouse to a manufactured home.
Yep.
And so I think there is a revelation going on in terms of like people understanding that we need to make this available. Yet the codes, we haven't done it for a while because the economics haven't, for lack of a better way, force people to do this, which I think now the economics of things are moving people more into considering manufactured homes because it's the only thing that they could afford to do and still have a safe, quality place.
Yeah.
And so I kind of bring this up because in a lot of times we have a situation where there is the motivation to do it, but the local municipality hasn't done it before. And they're kind of like verklempt in terms of like,
How
what do we do? We want to help you, but we've never done this before type of thing. And it seems to me that the more of that can get ironed out and sorted out is going to be helpful for more people adding more units.
Absolutely. I agree with that. This is where sharing information is potentially helpful, finding a way to communicate with other towns and cities that have done this. I'm not sure what that looks like, but
it's hard because you have local control, right?
Yeah.
Which isn't unique to Maine, but is largely a big New England thing with all these different municipalities. Like Maine has 1.4 million, I guess, people around that, and some 400 plus, I call them fiefdoms, little, organizations that are making the decision. And then the next zip code over, which is like 10 feet, is something totally different. And it just, I don't know, it seems like it's very difficult to, and I'm saying this as a state policymaker hat, like to affect broad change when ultimately locals like Waterville, where Colby College is, where where you're a professor. Like, for instance, the state passed a law that said you can have a manufactured home on any single-family house lot that doesn't otherwise preclude it in the deed or the subdivision restrictions, which that takes a lot of places right off the table. But when you're just driving down the road past a single-family house lot without those overlays, then you should be able to put a manufactured home there. But like Waterville changed their law to say, if you want to put a manufactured home in Waterville, go for it on any single-family lot, no problem. But thou shalt have a full foundation under it. It's like, what the heck? Like the way in which manufactured homes come to market at an affordable rate is the fact that they just pour a slab with hot-approved tie-downs and then move forward. Now you have to add $20,000, $30,000 to the cost to do the foundation. So here you have the spirit of the law, and then the local authority basically being like, well, we don't like the spirit of the law, so we're going to put in this thing that makes it a higher bar to jump over.
Yeah, that's the unfortunate thing with the way our democracy is structured, right? You've got these different agencies kind of working at odds with each other, and local areas will always find a way around a rule, state-level rule they don't like, it seems. And that's happened at the zoning level for sure. So I do think that there is some room for state-level legislation, LD 2003, different things like that. And of course, deed restrictions, zoning, those kinds of overlays are going to probably supersede any sort of state level law that comes around. But the interaction of these things, I think, is an important thing. I think getting states to do essentially what Maine has done, what California is doing on some of these is an important step forward. It's up to localities, I think, and this is where the competition of localities comes in, to sort of figure out a way to grow and grow sustainably and grow in the ways they want to grow, and potentially compete for valuable residents that expand the tax base and help improve public schools by allowing for more funding and all these different things that we like to see at the local level.
Yeah, this goes in really well to kind of like what's next in terms of your research and engagement. Are there areas of the report like short-term rentals or parking that you'd like to dive deeper into? And then how do you see your research helping towns actually take practical steps, maybe even beyond Maine for our audience that might be listening, nationally?
Yeah, I think going forward, I'd like to keep moving and studying more. I was just sort of talking with someone about this earlier. This is research that, for me, has raised more questions, which I think is a good sign that something research should do. Let's just keep building and building and building on it and learning more and more. The result we get for zoning versus non-zoned towns, where in zoning or zoned towns in the state of Maine, housing prices tend to be a bit higher. What's the mechanism? Why do we see that? We have some suspicions, some ideas, but I think it's going to require research that is going to require us to dig a bit deeper, and I think I'd like to do that. What exactly about the zoned cities is different? The zoned towns is different from those that are unzoned. Is it the approval process that's taking a long time? Is it just the different steps that we have in a zoned town versus a non-zoned town to build something? What is driving those price differences in otherwise similar places, right? So that's something I'd like to continue to do. I think there's so much more to learn, more about minimum lot size restrictions. Our sample was relatively small in the study, so we were only able to do so much with the analysis. But if we were to expand that and even look at a few localities specifically and get data on housing prices and zoning codes and minimum lot size restrictions in different parts of the towns, those could be useful variation for us to get at a more concise estimate of the impact that these are having. So there's a lot, I think, to do as far as that goes.
Do you think that this is something that the federal government needs to take on? Or is that like a bridge too far?
No, I think it's the federal government is working on something like this right now. They've got this renewed opportunity in the American Dream Act, which is something that's just passed through, I think, the Senate Banking Committee. It's a bill that's going to potentially show up in Congress to be voted upon. What's great about the bill, I'm just a quick look at it a couple days ago, I'm pretty excited about the potential. It's bipartisan, so it's being pushed by both Tim Scott, Republican, and Elizabeth Warren, a Democrat.
Yeah, I met Tim Scott one time. He came up to Maine and we talked about the opportunity zones, which I actually have an opportunity zone fund that I created. Yeah. And this community that we're going to look at starting is in an opportunity zone, which the feds, through the big beautiful Bill Act. Well, how beautiful it was, I don't know, but they did expand and extend the opportunity zones, and they're going to be focusing more on rural parts of the country. But Tim seems to be a very forward-thinking, innovative kind of guy.
Yeah, I think he recognizes there's a problem here, and so does Elizabeth Warren, and it's great to see that bipartisan effort. And they're doing things like trying to force some streamlining of the zoning codes among localities in the country, providing innovation funds for the building out of infrastructure that supports new housing, grants and that sort of thing. So there's a lot there, I think, that could potentially move the needle a little bit at the federal level. Again, it all comes down to localities and how they respond. Oftentimes they find ways around things if they want to. So hopefully this bill kind of works its way through and some of those loopholes are kind of considered and taken into account. But I think there is something at every level that can be done. I think, LD 2003, very exciting kind of thing to happen here in Maine, and Maine was on the forefront of this, and I think it's great. It's gotten a lot of national attention. Definitely something states can do.
Well, but on 2003, I was in the legislature when we passed it, and I was the only Republican senator to vote in favor of it. And it's kind of interesting to me because the conversations that I had with my colleagues was like, hey, guys, last time I checked, Republicans are in favor of the free market and less government intervention. But now in the vein of local control, which is like hyper local federalism, if you want, you're trying to make a case for why the government should have power at that level to tell people what they can do with their land. I'm like, is
Where's
this
the
really
disconnect?
happening right
Yeah,
now? Like,
yeah.
and I understand the desire to make the power and control closest to the people, but ultimately now you're exerting overarching government role here
Yep.
that is precluding actually free market enterprise from happening.
Yeah, it's precluding the development of what you see fit to develop on your property, right? So you have property rights to an extent, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that's something. Yeah, that's why I think this is a bipartisan issue. I think there are aspects of housing affordability that speak to both parties, aspects of building out the housing stock that speak to both parties. If you're concerned about social issues, of course, housing affordability is a big part of that. You're concerned about inequality. A big driver of inequality, wealth inequality in the U.S. is the difference between the haves and have-nots with respect to housing. If you have a house, you're doing okay. If you don't, you're not. That's a big source of that inequality. You could speak to the desire for your kids and grandkids to have a place to call their own and to be able to afford it. That's, I think, on both sides of the aisle, should sort of support that.
It's interesting, though, and I never closed the loop on the whole George Hale Tyler thing, but what I was trying to say is they did a post on their website that day that said, can Maine, grow its way towards solving the housing problem? And it was something like 80% of people said no. And I'm like, this is really fascinating to me because it seems like what we have is both like a real logistical problem in terms of our workforce and everything, but also too just a mindset problem of a disbelief that growth will bring prosperity. That's really hard to overcome.
Yeah, and there are big reasons for this, I think, in the last 30, 40 years. Growth for the U.S. has meant globalization and the offshoring of jobs. And so there's some concern there about what growth actually means for me. I don't see the prosperity. I lost my job because it was offshored or whatever. So there are legitimate concerns there, and I think that disconnect between growth and prosperity has grown, pretty wide in the last few years. Politically, I think we're seeing that play out. So that's where I think more focus on what we can do at the local level is potentially helpful, and studying these things. Studying housing prices and trying to dig into what's causing the growth in those is an important dimension and an important, avenue for policy going forward.
Yeah, I mean, to be able to use real data to say, hey, look, if you don't make... I've always thought the State Chamber of Commerce should commission a study, maybe they could hire you, that would say, hey, the cost of not growing is this.
Sure.
Because it's always why we can't afford to do it or whatever. Okay, no problem. Let's just say that this proposal doesn't happen.
Right.
Here's an actual thing that has to be given with every development proposal in Maine that shows the cost of not doing this.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because then people would be like, maybe, this really does impact my pocketbook directly if I say no.
Yeah. I've read about this idea. I think that's gaining a little bit of traction. It might have been in the book Abundance by Derek Thompson and Ezra Klein. I don't know. But there was some discussion of cities and towns, they should be doing these kinds, or other agencies should be doing these kinds of calculations of what will it cost if we do nothing, right? And what are we looking at if that's the case? It's all about weighing benefits and costs. Some of those we can perceive, some of those we can't. The future is tough to predict, of course.
What role does the employer? I just could keep going forever because I appreciate your view being one rooted in real science and economics, not just hyperbole. What role does the employer play in this? Because I think, and I've talked about it before on the show, I think of Rumford, Maine, for instance, that in 85 had a population of 450 people. And then an enterprising individual showed up with a plan for a dam and to build a mill. And then was like, shit, actually, I need some housing too, or else I'll never be able to get people to move to Rumford to work at this mill. Yeah. So he, as the mill owner, not too different from a lot of mill owners over the years, built up the housing too. And now I'm seeing, maybe only newly, in fact, the director of the Chamber of Commerce here in Maine has said, and I've been working on housing for about a year now, and that's not a negative. I'm thankful that they're at the table in that capacity, but it doesn't seem to me that in the modern era, employers have really spent much, if any time at all, on the housing creation side. It's just like, if I offer the job at this wage, that will figure itself out, and it's not. And you're starting to see like LL Bean's building a new building in Freeport, Bath Iron Works, some of the larger ones have committed to saying, look, we don't want to figure out the development side or whatever, but we'll lease X number of units from you guaranteed when it's done. And that, to me, seems to be the way in which the employer community is going to have to engage. But I'm curious if you've followed this at all with employers, or if there's even a role really for them actually to play other than just little one-offs.
Yeah, good question. I really haven't followed that. I mean, I think there's some historical precedent here for this, in that a lot of towns were company towns, especially in sort of the coal regions of the country, and they provided things like housing and company stores and that sort of thing. Over time, those became less important, but they were seen as a benefit, right, for those individuals that were working. I think let the market try it, right, and let these employers give it a shot. I think what they're responding to is probably employees who are saying, look, the housing here is right. It's just too
Colby
expensive,
as
right?
an institution has experienced this.
We're
right?
experiencing this, absolutely. So there's a point where you kind of have to do something if you're going to attract
Colby
people.
did do that. They bought like half of downtown Waterville and made it cool.
Yeah, yeah, and
it's coming.
And they're building some units and so on down there. Housing units. A lot of what they've done so far has been focused on the cultural aspects of downtown, but absolutely, there's room for them to kind of to do this, to attract good people, and I think go for it. I support that 100%. I was trying to think of there's another example in mind. I mean, there are definitely colleges and universities who provide housing for faculty in really expensive places like LA and, Orange County, Irvine, where I'm from, there was subsidized faculty housing. So it seems to work well. That does attract good people. Otherwise, it's just way too pricey. You can't do it. It's an unfortunate thing that we have to do that. I think it would be great to allow the market to supply those things, and the employers, of course, are part of that. But I think the question is why is that necessary to begin with, and is that just a Band-Aid on a bigger problem?
Yeah, which it probably is in a lot of respects, because if you have an environment in which the development community is just like, it's a no-brainer to go do a project there, then it's going to happen with or without the employer involvement.
Right.
As we wrap up, I want to ask kind of two questions. And the first is, if you were to wave a magic wand and there were one change that every Maine town could consider this year, like what should that be?
Good question. I would say take inventory. Imagine yourself as a developer coming in, wanting to build a certain project. What do they need to do to get that to completion? And ask yourself, as a town, as a city, what is necessary here? What are the benefits and costs of this particular regulation that we have on the books, or this step that's involved? The minimum lot size restriction at the state level, I think, is 20,000 square feet.
Yeah.
So if you have something more than that, ask yourself why. That, our study shows, is an important lever that you have as a locality to potentially reduce housing prices. Can you bring that down 10,000, 20,000 feet or square feet? So I would say taking inventory is a good first step. If I could wave a magic wand, that's a difficult question to answer, because there's so many layers to it. But I would love to see towns take this seriously, to take inventory of what their processes look like, and to actually study it and imagine themselves being a developer who wants to build there. What kind of town do you want to be? Do you want to be a town that gates people out, or do you want to be a town that that helps others, welcomes others? There's so much to say. There are a lot of reasons why we should care about housing affordability. We talked about the social issues, but from a growth perspective, a productivity perspective, we are much more productive as a society, as a country, if people can move where they want, where they're most valued, where their labor is most valued. We can't say that people can do that in today's world.
Right.
They cannot just pick up and move where they're most valued and where their skill set's most valued. There are a lot of, I think, tech engineers who don't live in San Francisco and aren't, working in the most productive environment because housing is incredibly prohibitive, right? The housing costs are just too high.
Yeah.
So as a country, if we worked to reduce the barriers to building more housing and reducing the housing prices that way, this research shows that's going to be good for GDP, for productivity. Everybody's richer for it.
Yeah, it seems that a lot of folks aren't considering the fact that the home is also, for many, the modern office.
Yes.
Today, I just went through the Maine Community College System building because they don't own the building, but the landlord's selling it. We're going to be selling it for them. I'm like, where is everybody? There was it's their admin office, and this is the way in which all companies operate, it seems, these days. So this isn't a knock on the community college system, but,
right.
It's like, what did they even need to be leasing all this space for? And if people have a nice home that they can afford and they're given the latitude to work from home and they're just as productive, our whole thing gets turned on its head because we've built out this whole environment around the notion of everybody's going to get in their car and drive into the place of work and then get back and drive out. That's not even happening post-COVID anymore. Yeah, well, I shouldn't say anymore, but
right. It has stabilized. I mean, this is something that we've seen sort of stop. The work from home trend has kind of stabilized a bit. So it hasn't kept growing in ways that some people feared. I think there are a lot of companies in New York and other dense urban environments that are asking people to come back to work, realizing the importance of working together in a location, sharing information, sharing ideas. That all makes people more productive, right? Urban economists call those agglomeration economies, the savings we get from clustering together and working in close proximity. Those kinds of things are difficult to force in a Zoom sort of environment. And so I think work from home, I'm not going to say it's hit its limits, but it's certainly stabilized in recent years. And so maybe that scare has gone away. People still want to be near one another. They still want to share ideas with one another in serendipitous ways. And so to the extent that firms value that and see that, and employees as well, cities like San Francisco, I mean, we're talking about big cities, but you could think about Portland as well, that artificially restrict the housing supply and raise housing prices are keeping those types of people from moving into these areas who otherwise would be there and contributing to the economy there.
Yeah, because Portland recently put in place rent control, which a lot of people that advocated for it were like, hey, this needs to happen to keep rent down. But it seems like it's just stifling development. It
is, yeah. I mean, that's what the economics would suggest. It's one of those things that, again, discourages development, discourages developers from taking on new construction. It reduces the quality of these structures. The maintenance is down on rent-controlled structures. There's a lot that's wrong with it. Again, though, I think it's, potentially another one of those Band-Aid fixes. It gets a lot of airplay. I think it's one of those ideas that people understand on the surface, but they don't sort of think about the unintended consequences of these actions and these policies. And
so I'll add Matt's change for Maine, which is no more rent control. So I really appreciate your time today. It's hard to imagine we've already gone through over an hour. And I'm curious, though, if people want to read more about your work or reach out to you, how would they do that?
That's good. Thanks for asking that. I'm not super involved on social media. So I do have a website, jamessiodla.com, so JAMESSIODLA.com. All my research is on there. If you're interested in what I teach and the things I'm teaching to my urban economics class, my city and economic history class, the syllabi are up there. Feel free to take a look. Reading materials up there. Some of those are, academic articles and so on. But that's a good way to get a sense of what I'm talking about with students at Colby and the things I'm teaching. And, my research is up there as well. And feel free to contact me via email. I'm happy to have discussions about housing and think more about these things.
Great, Jim. Thank you so much for your time today. This has been a very robust and worthwhile conversation, and appreciate you taking the time.
My pleasure. It's been fun.